Okay. The book talks about countries and the things that have counted against them. For Australia, it talks about Australia having two strikes against it, the huge current account deficits and the deterioration in the terms of trade. There's no question that Australia's run big current account deficits for a very long time, but for most of that time, and certainly in the last 5 years, that has been funding a huge lift in investment in the traded sector, largely in the mining sector. And so I'm not pessimistic about that at all. My take on this, and this to some extent resonates with things that Ross has said on other occasions. If China and India go on growing at the sort of rates that they, and it's also part of the narrative of the book, if China and India go on growing at the sort of rates that they have been growing, then that mining investment will pay off big time, and Australia is in an extremely advantageous position, and the current account will have funded investment that by and large will be extremely profitable. That's the first point. So the two strikes that Australia has against it are the big current account deficits and the deterioration in the terms of trade. Now, I don't have a chart of the terms of trade here, but the striking thing about Australia's terms of trade is that even after the financial crisis, the terms of trade are still something like 45% above their average of the 1990s. So there was a huge run-up and it's come down a little bit, but we still have terms of trade which look extraordinarily favourable with the benefit of history. So it's true that there's been a deterioration in the terms of trade with the global financial crisis, but I think the striking thing, and it's something that will count in our favour, is that they are still as high as they are. Okay. I'm not going to say any more about Australia. There are two other macro issues that the book very rightly draws attention to. The first is the consenting adult's view of the current account. That's my phrase. Well, it's actually not my phrase. It's the phrase I use, but other people came up with it first. The idea that you don't have to worry about the current account because it's basically the outcome of decisions by private individuals, and that they will take their benefits or pay the costs if things go wrong. And the book rightly makes the point that if there is a global financial crisis in which the New York and London capital markets effectively close down, and we are in a world where our banks borrow large amounts of in wholesale markets. If that world exists and the government has to come in and guarantee those debts in extraordinary circumstances, then that changes the debate about the consenting adult's view of the current account. I agree with that statement. This has been an extremely important event in thinking about the current account. I haven't completely come to decided what I think anymore, but I'm certainly in the camp of Keynes when he said, when the facts change, I change my mind. That this has been a relevant event, and I need to think more about it before pontificating further. The other thing that on macro that the book draws attention to are the problem of asset price bubbles. The book comes to the view that monetary policy should take more interest in asset price bubbles. I absolutely agree that asset price bubbles are a huge issue. They were a very serious contributing factor in this global financial crisis. And as I said earlier, had the crisis turned up 5 years earlier, we might have been in a much uglier place than we are now. So I very much buy the idea that asset price bubbles are potentially a very serious problem. Whether you can use monetary policy to deal with them is, in my view, a much thornier question. I have no objection in theory, but my objections are practical ones. When investors are expecting double-digit rates of return on a rising asset bubble and are perhaps not in their most rational frame of mind, the idea that raising interest rates by 0.5% or 1%, or for that matter 1.5%, is going to make very much difference is unclear. And the other thing is that monetary policy lags make the whole thing very fraught. So I think that's actually, in the case of more work, needs to be done. And the only other thought there is whether there are, and this is a live issue, whether there are macroprudential things that you can do to better target asset price bubbles. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
What a pleasure it is to be here and in this illustrious company on both sides of the podium. When I got this book, I could hardly put it down. It's such a terrific read. It has the same driving pace and verve as Galbraith's original Great Crash. And of course, the madness of crowds is always amusing, amazing, jaw-dropping, especially if we've lived through it, as we all have. I've been allocated what I suspect is the biggest part of the elephant. It's the body, and it's probably the hardest to put shape into, that is the financial sector. And I need to register just one difference of opinion. I think this book is written as if Australia went through basically the same experience as the US. In the US, it was an old-fashioned financial crash, like 1907, when JP Morgan locked the bankers in the library and told them that he wouldn't let them out until they'd sorted it out. The financial sector caused the US downturn. I think the Australian experience was our usual externally generated shock, which affected our financial sector, and of course financial sectors then go on and exacerbate other problems through knock-on effects, but it wasn't caused by the weakness of the financial sector. Now, is this just me defending my old patch? I can hear the Mandy Rice-Davis echo. He would say that, wouldn't he? Well, maybe. But I think understanding what happened, and more importantly, the new world that we're in, is vital for good policy making. The agenda for Australian policymakers is, I think the big question in front of them is when to turn off or turn back, wind back the fiscal stimulus. There aren't major issues in the financial sector. Our financial sector came through this just fine. If we take the rankings of banks in the world, there's only one AAA bank left, and there's, on my understanding, 8 AA banks left. Australia has 4 of those top 9 in the world. Now, there are lots of isolated events. Opus Prime, Bridgegate, Orco, Lehman's and the local council, Babcock and Brown, potentially Qantas, say, that would have been a mess, Storm Finance, but no structural damage. There are some unresolved issues. David has talked about the ones in the financial sector. Asset prices are still an unresolved issue, and David's made the point that I would have made, that even though we accept that asset prices are a major problem, I don't think you can use the one instrument which central banks have at the moment, that is the interest rate, to eliminate asset prices. And it may be that central banks will be given some so-called macroprudential instruments, but at the moment, those macroprudential instruments or those prudential instruments lie with the prudential regulator. They're things like capital ratios, and you could imagine a world where you, instead of the finance sector having a pro-cyclical effect on the cycle, you actually change capital and liquidity ratios and maybe loan-to-valuation ratios. But they're all micro-instruments which, to the extent that they rest anywhere, are with the prudential supervisor. So that has to be sorted out. But I think of that as a problem that can be sorted out. As far as the macro goes, Bill White from the BIS, who's given a lot of credit for seeing many of these problems, he looks back on he looks at the choice facing the central banks as still leaning or cleaning, leaning against the asset price increases or cleaning up after the event. And central banks, even before the crisis, there were many, including the RBA, who understood that a bit of judicious leaning against the crisis would be a good idea. Some of you might recall how the real estate agents were up in arms in the early part of the 2000s because they thought the Reserve Bank was pushing interest rates up too much. I don't think the efficient markets hypothesis was a central policy belief among the authorities, and the HIH failure cleaned out any proponents that might have been around and sorted out APRA. There wasn't any light touch, or what some people call easy touch supervision in Australia, and the four pillars, for all its other problems, probably helped us by restraining the degree of competition between the big four. I think of the overseas borrowings and the guarantee that was given on those as being like a lender of last resort. We've always known that financial sectors were fragile and you needed some authority like a central bank that would stand ready to lend in extremis. And if for some reason the banks had not been able to borrow in New York, they would simply have come to the central bank and borrowed there and shifted the problem of funding the current account to someone else. Now contrast this with the US, as set out so clearly by Ross and David. They had a dispersed regulatory framework that encouraged regulatory shopping. They had the most extraordinary mortgage contracts. Interest rates, if the interest rates moved against you, you could take your contract back and have it renegotiated. If you found that things were getting a bit tough, you could flick the key back to the lender and move off to something else. We didn't have anything equivalent to the ninja borrowers. Sorry, we did have some equivalent. There were non-complying loans in Australia, but they were 0.5% of outstanding loans. There was no physical overbuilding, David's shown that, and we didn't have the very low interest rates that in America were a response to the tech wreck. Interest rates, let me think if I can get this right, I'm not sure that you could have ever borrowed below 7% this century in Australia. Of course, we didn't have the problem of investment banks. We didn't have the shadow banking sector to the same degree with its high leverage and dependence on money market. And most of the action, the lending action in America, was in the securitized sector of the market, relying on slicing and dicing, derivative credit wraps and credit rating endorsements, what you might call paid endorsements. And of course, we didn't have, to any of the same degree, the Wall Street lobby, which has made the political economy of this so difficult. I think this diagnosis and the special position of Australia is important because I think if we misdiagnose this, we'll do some silly policies. I see a plan put forward that the government should guarantee all resident-backed, mortgage-backed securities, give the AAA rating behind any little organisation that issues mortgage bonds to fund mortgages. And this would seem to me an extraordinarily foolish idea. Now, if Australia is in a relatively good position, what about America? I think this is where the story is. And I think there are 4 areas that need to be fundamentally changed in America. Obviously, regulation, more capital. But I'd have to say, looking back on this crisis, you have to ask yourself, what degree of capital would have actually saved this crisis? So I don't personally have much hope that a minor shift in capital is actually going to solve the problem. Do it by all means. Important thing to do, but I don't think it'll fix the problem. I think maybe the structure of the financial sector needs a lot more thinking about. What we see in recent years is the way it conglomerated, the way it became interconnected. And those old separations, putting bits of it in different boxes, done in America with the Glass-Steagall Act, I think there was basic common sense in those things. The idea that we might need a financial sector which is in which the institutions are more specialised, where you can see more clearly, are these the central core institutions which take in money from the widows and orphans and lend them out in simple ways, what you might think of as the core of the financial sector, or is this the last resort lorry out there on the very edge of the financial sector. And I should say we need the last resort lorries. This is the way you get your innovation done. But we need to make sure that we don't mix the casinos with the utilities. Then I think the most serious problem for America is the clear problem of the political economy of all of this, the way the financial sector was basically in the pocket of Wall Street for all sorts of reasons, money, jobs, the whole story. And then fourth area, macro policy. Behind every crisis you can see a macro mistake. In this case I think it's clear that the low interest rates in America following the tech wreck were a serious macro area. And so I think we face very different tasks now, America compared with Australia. America has unemployment of almost 10%, has a current account deficit nearly as big as ours. It has a fiscal problem, a deficit running at 12% of GDP. It has an exchange rate which has fallen a lot already, which needs to fall, which is part of the process of fixing this system. But as it falls, that will create a set of problems because they still need the capital inflow. They still need the Chinese to keep their money in foreign exchange reserves, and that's going to be harder to do. And of course, their banks are in a completely different position from Australian banks. Their banks still contain large amounts of non-performing loans. But on top of that, the shadow banking system, which Greenspan once described as the spare tyre, which could be used if anything went wrong with the banking system. The problem is that that shadow banking system has been doing all the hard lifting for some years now. And it turns out that they've been running on the spare tyre, and now the spare tyre has gone flat. I find it hard to believe that securitisation of the kinds that we've seen over the last 5 years with complex structured products can come back any time soon. What it needs is credit wraps, reduction of the complexity of slicing and dicing, and credit rating agencies. The credit wraps and the credit rating agencies, both totally discredited. AIG won't be there to provide the credit wrap next time. And the other credit rating agencies, where we find the mortgage-backed securities, of which they gave AAA rating, 90% of them were downgraded during the crisis, and 60% of them were downgraded to B or less, in other words, not even investment grade. So America is clearly a long way out of the woods, and I think that fits with what Ross and David are saying. And in that sense, I want to particularly commend Ross's last chapter. I think the role of markets and the role of governments and regulation still needs a lot of sorting out, and Ross's book takes us some way to do that. Thank you.
The starting point here is the economic underpinnings of the international political system. And the key point that Ross wants to push here is that while wealth and economic growth are by no means everything in the long-term exercise of power globally, they are foundational. They really matter over time. And the core message that he's putting forward here is basically that global financial crisis has accelerated, as he calls it, tectonic shifts that were already underway, but they're accelerating these tectonic movements in global power relations, and it's principally as a result of the rise of China and India. So if most of the second half of the 20th century was basically the bipolar Cold War world, and then we had a brief so-called unipolar period in which US dominance was largely unchallenged, what Ross is telling us is that we can look forward to coming out of this crash is accelerated movement, in his phrase, towards a quadripolar world. So Europe, United States, India, China. This argument gives rise to all sorts of interesting issues and questions. Let me pick up on just two of them here. One is to have a bit of a think about this notion of a possibly quadrupolar world emerging. And the other is to think a bit more broadly about what this might mean for international policy cooperation. On the quadrupolar idea, although it's controversial, there's a lot of discussion about it, my sense is that the clearest part of that is the shifting relativities between the United States and China. My expectation is that the United States will certainly remain the dominant global power for the foreseeable future. Its size, its wealth, its technology, its demographics, its capacity for political renewal. I mean, these are all formidable assets for the long term. But it is clearly going to be increasingly constrained by China's rise, and the rest of the world is already factoring this in. This is already happening. In my view, there's just no question there's a gradual, if intangible, shift in the power relativities going on between Washington and Beijing. But just as it's important not to be in denial about this, so too it's important not to exaggerate the extent or speed of it. I think the harder questions about the quadrupolar proposition are actually to do with the rest of the other elements in the Quad, in particular Europe. Notwithstanding Ireland's vote on the Lisbon Treaty, I just can't help wondering how far Europe's really going to go in terms of getting cohesiveness on international policy issues. I'm not talking about within Europe issues, on international policy issues, particularly military issues, in ways that have any real traction globally. I just wonder about that. And I wonder if we're not underplaying the importance still of Russia in all of this, given its considerable military capabilities, particularly nuclear capabilities, that I think will imply wider influence beyond that which its economic profile would suggest. So just some questions to think about there on the quadrupolar proposition. I think the second issue, the wider nature of international cooperation and how that's going to be affected by the Great Crash, is actually a more interesting and more pressing question. We all understand that international policy coordination is just really important on a whole bunch of big problems. Ross's book alerts us to two particular implications of the crash for international policy cooperation. One is the need for evolution or change in the constituencies of the main international organisations. The basic point here is that China and India are underrepresented and Europe is overrepresented, and this is just going to have to change. The second, more subtle point is that multilateral fora of various sorts around the world that are responsive to these tectonic shifts, to use the phrase, are likely to have added traction, added momentum relative to those that aren't responsive. And a nice clear illustration of that we're all familiar with is the G20. I mean, G20 is clearly responsive, among other things, to these tectonic shifts. That's key to that forum gaining added traction at the moment. But I think we can take this issue of nature of international policy cooperation further still. As the United States' relative dominance in world affairs is increasingly curtailed, we're likely to face increasing difficulties in the provision of global public goods. And the underlying reason for this is fairly straightforward, and that is that any nation that's in a unambiguously hegemonic position is more likely to be willing to bear the costs of other nations' free riding on policy cooperation. And as the United States' position becomes less and less like that, so its willingness to bear those costs is likely to decline. I don't want to overstate this problem. Both because the United States itself, not infrequently, disappoints in the exercise of global leadership, and because hegemonic solutions aren't the only solutions to the problem of how to get international cooperation. But I think it does mean that it will be that bit much harder to get major global cooperation on big policy questions. And that I think is particularly so during what we might think of as these sort of transitional years, as this more pluralised global power structure emerges. Let me finish up with two wider reflections on the implications of this book for international and regional politics. One is a thought about what this is going to mean for intra-Asian regional dynamics, sort of political dynamics within the Asian region. And the other is a thought about tectonic plates, China, India, and inexorable rises. Absolutely no question, the Great Crash has important implications for regional political dynamics in the greater Asian region. Crudely, it accelerates and confirms China's position as the central player in Asia. For everyone else in the region, this the issue of how the region talks to itself and how the region organises itself assumes increasing importance as China's regional dominance becomes clearer and clearer. This isn't new. This really started to get moving following the Asian financial crisis, but it's clearly been pushed strongly now by the knock-on effects of the global financial crisis. And countries around the region are starting to move quickly now on this issue. Australia, of course, was one of the early ones here with Rudd's Asia-Pacific Community idea. The US is moving in signing the ASEAN Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Japan is now moving with East Asia, with Hatayama's East Asia Community idea. I mean, the general point is there's now going to be increasing interest in moving more quickly towards rationalising arrangements within the region. And the last point, because I can see Selwyn waving at me, is a note of, if not scepticism, then a notch or two less confidence than Ross about the tectonic metaphor and the notion of China and India's inexorable rise. Ross has got this great line from Edwin Reischauer reflecting back on the history of looking at Japan and saying what it meant for US-Japan relations and having always underestimated the pace of Japan's rise, with the wider point being, there's just a bias in our projections towards conservatism. And we tend to take more conservative positions, and that's Ross's own experience in thinking about China. And I certainly buy that point, but I just can't help wondering whether words like inexorable are really the right ones. I remember when I first started to read about and think about the political economy of growth around Asia, and one of the cardinal lessons in the literature back then was that it's hard to get your policies right. It's hard, it's politically hard to get prices right. And it's really, really politically hard to do that on a sustained basis over a long period of time. That's not how we think now. I mean, to the point that words like inexorable can be used by really serious and informed people like Ross. But if one of the, to me, big lessons out of this book is that some old economic lessons and insights are still powerful today and need to be brushed off and rediscovered, I can't help wondering if that's not also true about some of the old political economy lessons and insights. Thanks.